Now, despite the rising internal protests within the state of Israel and also the growing international pressure, there is still no clarity yet on a potential Gaza ceasefire deal. Now, faced with the prospect of a potential failure of talks, the United States is now scaling down its expectations, focusing instead on a completely different set of aims at the moment. Take a look at this report.
Under pressure to commit to a truce in Gaza, Israel is stepping up its strikes on all fronts, conducting raids in Gaza localities, mounting attacks in the West Bank, raising the questions as to whether Israel, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, is at all interested in pursuing peace. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is one of those who have been publicly urging the Israeli Prime Minister to be flexible in truce negotiations with Hamas. Their public spats over the issue have prompted Netanyahu to say he wants to sack Gallant. Now Washington is sending out a clear message telling Netanyahu not to do so, and that they are satisfied with the cooperation with Gallant. According to local Israeli media reports, the US message was polite but clear. Faced with Netanyahu's stonewalling attempts on peace, the US is giving vent to its frustration. It is telling Netanyahu that tensions need to be reduced amid a potential Iran attack that threatens a wider all-out regional conflict. In a blunt message, the US says its aircraft carrier cannot stay in the region to defend Israel forever. In the backdrop of the US hard talk, the Israeli forces have withdrawn from Jenin in the occupied West Bank after a 10-day-long siege. At least 21 people were killed in Jenin city and the refugee camp, the Palestinian Ministry of Health has said. Faced with the constant stonewalling of the truce efforts, the US is indicating it is making its own plans for the possible collapse of ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. General C.Q. Brown, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, says the US is focused on how not to broaden the conflict and also how to protect its forces. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in the peace and negotiations that have gone on now for several weeks and months and have still yielded very little results, we're being joined by Mr. Charles Kupchan, who's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, Mr. Kupchan, let me in fact start off by asking you this. Now, for several weeks and months, we've been hearing from the American side, which is a lead mediator in this entire crisis, that we are close to a ceasefire and a hostage exchange deal, but that deal has not materialized. What do you think is going wrong, and why is it that the Americans have not been able to use their leverage so far in the Israelis adequately enough to get a ceasefire deal?
Well, I think the United States, as you said, has been trying its best to get a ceasefire deal. Tireless diplomacy by Secretary of State Tony Blinken, lots of phone calls from President Biden to leaders in the region. I think the first stage is an easy one to get agreement on, and that is a temporary pause in the fighting, which would allow the hostages to come home and some Palestinian prisoners to be released. But the real sticking point is what comes next, where the Israelis are basically saying, we're not going to go back to the previous situation where the borders of Gaza, particularly the border of Gaza with Egypt, is open to smuggling. And the Hamas is saying, well, we're not going to agree to any outcome in which Israel either occupies Gaza or has control over those boundary lines. And neither side is able to get past that fundamental disagreement. I think what's happening right now is the United States isn't giving up, but it's expressing its frustration with the fact that tireless diplomacy has not gotten the parties close to the finish line.
That's interesting. Tireless diplomacy hasn't gotten the parties to the finish line, but also considering the fact that there are clear differences between the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. There's been a lot of talk in terms of how things have gone on back and forth between the two of them. And this report, which now states that the Americans have sent a message to Netanyahu that Yoav Gallant should not be sacked. What's your reading into this?
Well, listen, this is a pretty far-right Israeli government, the most far-right in Israeli history. And the United States sees Yoav Gallant as probably the most serious, influential voice of reason and voice of restraint. He has broken openly with Netanyahu on the question of whether Hamas can be completely defeated. He was critical of Netanyahu's effort to orchestrate legal changes. This goes back to before October 7 and the outbreak of war with Gaza. He has also encouraged Netanyahu to agree to remove Israeli forces from the border with between Gaza and Egypt, a key sticking point in the ceasefire negotiations. So he's on record disagreeing with the prime minister, and that's one of the reasons there's a lot of tension. But I think the United States is saying, don't get rid of your defense minister because he is an important player here and he could prevent the Israelis from even going further in terms of opening a wider war in the region.
And also in the same report, the interesting comment that seems to have come forth is that American aircraft carriers that are being pressed into service, potentially for the defense of Israel, in case the conflict were to expand. The Americans seem to be telling the Israelis that these aircraft carriers cannot stay there forever. Do you think the Americans would ever follow through on this kind of a threat that is being sent out to the Israeli Prime Minister?
Well, listen, I think nobody expected, going back to late July, early August, when Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran, that we would make it to September without a significant act of Iranian retaliation against Israel. That retaliation hasn't occurred yet, nor have we seen a major effort by Hezbollah in Lebanon to attack Israel. And I think that the role that the United States has played here is important. 2 aircraft carriers in the region, more fighter aircraft in the region, announcement of the arrival of an American submarine in the region. The message is here, Iran, Hezbollah, be careful what you wish for. And so I think that deterrence has been effective, as well as Israeli deterrence. But the United States is saying to Israel, listen, we can't leave these aircraft carriers in the region forever. You need to cool down the temperature and make sure that we're not on the edge of a broader Middle East war.
All right, we'll have to leave there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Charles Kupchan, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Good to be with you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.